All right, today we're going to talk about disorders, nutritional disorders that you commonly see in grazing scenarios, especially in Oklahoma. And the first one that we talked about is bloat, pasture bloat. And this happens commonly in wheat pasture and also is common in alfalfa and certain types of clovers. And what happens is you can see in this picture that the left side of this animal, their side is puffed up and distended, and what that is the rumen of the animal actually approaches right up to the skin surface on the left side of the gut there behind the rib cage, and because the ribs um, are compressing the front part of the rumen, there's no bone structure compressing the back part. And as the rumen fills with gas, it distends out the left side of the animal behind the rib cage. And so what you're seeing there when animals bloat like that is the actual distension of the rumen as it's filling with gas. And that gas comes from fermentation of the forage that these cattle are consuming. And normally there's gas production as a byproduct of all fermentation in the rumen. That's a normal process. But what happens in bloat is that some of the chemical constituents of the forage, we think it's certain kinds of proteins, actually make a foam that captures the gas that the bacterial population is releasing, and does not allow the animal to be able to eructate that gas as they normally would. So the gas gets trapped in little bubbles in the foam, and the foam's stable. The foam doesn't break down, and so those animals can't eructate it and belch out that gas as normal. There's quite a bit of gas production that happens in normal fermentation, and so these animals can get bloated pretty quickly on wheat pasture. Lots of times, what you'll see is the in some cases the first symptom that you'll see is a dead animal when you go check the pasture. Bloat can happen and progress rapidly and kill animals pretty quickly. So that's kind of what bloat looks like and what that is. So that's wheat pasture bloat. Again, real common in wheat pasture, common in alfalfa and clover and high quality forages that have the protein structure that causes that foam to build up. There are a couple of management strategies that you can use to try to mitigate bloat potential. One is to always fill cattle on some hay or something before you turn them out to a new pasture, to try to minimize how much of that forage that gets dumped into the rumen all at once and causes that protein matrix to form. You can feed a couple of different kinds of feed additives. One is a chemical called paloxylene that is included in the trade name is bloat guard, one of the trade names, and that chemical is kind of a soap. It's a surfactant, and it kind of works like a soap, and it breaks down the foam. It releases the surface tension on the foam, and releases the free gas into the rumen, and lets the animals eructate it as normally. That's a very if the cattle get a dose of paloxylene, it's very effective, and basically treats bloat, and the bloat goes away in a matter of several minutes. The trick with paloxylene is making sure that the cattle get a consistent dose of it. It doesn't have any carryover effect once it leaves the rumen, and so basically a dose of paloxylene is effective for maybe 6 hours. And then if the cattle don't eat it again, that paloxylene's gone, and that the effect of that's gone, and the bloat can come right back. So, but you can get bloat guard paloxylene. You can get it in a dose where you can actually tube the animal and treat them directly with a dose of it into the rumen. You can mix it in mineral supplements. You can mix it in feed supplements, in blocks that cattle will go out and lick in the pasture. And so there's different ways to supply paloxylene, And the trick with paloxalene is getting a consistent dose in every animal that's at risk all the time. So another feed additive that's effective against bloat, it's not on the label, but it's effective against bloat, is monensin. And the ionophore monensin alters fermentation in the rumen. That's where you see the benefits that you see with monensin in terms of gain and performance. It's because it's modifying the fermentation, and when it does modify the fermentation, the animals produce less gas, and so there's less gas um, to get um, to get trapped in the foam, and bloat is less severe when cattle get a dose of monensin. And so those are a couple of ways that you can kind of mitigate bloat in wheat pasture. And I guess it's probably obvious, but I forgot to mention earlier that the reason bloat causes cattle to die is just asphyxiation, just physically suffocating them because their lungs get compressed where they can't breathe because of the bloat. So that's wheat pasture bloat. The next disorder is, or it's two disorders, but they're very similar and related and talked about at the same time in a lot of cases. And this is nitrate and prussic acid poisoning. And these disorders are very common in certain forage species that are known to be nitrate and prussic acid accumulators. Forage species like Johnson grass, um, sorghum Sudans are common in this category. Some weeds like kochia weed and different kinds of weeds like that, pigweed accumulate nitrates, and corn actually does. Bermuda grass can a little bit, but we typically are worried about nitrate and prussic acid in Johnson grass in Oklahoma. And these two chemicals are work a little differently, but basically they both accumulate in the plants in response to some plant stress. Okay, and nitrate especially in plants that have been highly fertilized with nitrogen. And so these happen a lot of times, not so much when plants are drought stressed, but if plants have been drought stressed and then it rains and they start growing quickly, that's when you'll see a lot of times that they'll accumulate nitrates. Um, the nitrate, when the animals consume it, it actually binds the hemoglobin in their blood, prevents it from binding oxygen, and so it asphyxiates the animals chemically by not allowing oxygen to circulate to their tissues. And prussic acid kind of does the same thing. It doesn't really bind the hemoglobin and prevent the hemoglobin from transporting oxygen, but it prevents the oxygen from getting into the tissues and being used metabolically at the end product. So both nitrate and prussic acid cause an oxygen starvation in the animal, and that's how they kill the animals. If you were to find an animal that you suspected died from prussic acid poison or from nitrate poisoning, and you took a blood sample of that animal, the blood would be kind of chocolate brown. It would be, because it doesn't have oxygen in it. It would be a brown color, and that's a lot of times a real indicative of nitrate poisoning. Prussic acid poisoning, the blood will be red because there's oxygen in the blood, and the hemoglobin is just not able to get into the tissues. But these two things are related. If you have nitrate and prussic acid toxic forage, the best thing to do is just not graze it and allow the animal, or allow the forage to mature a little time to go by. And in a lot of cases, the nitrate and prussic acid concentration will come down naturally as the plants grow and recover from whatever stress that they were under. There are some quick tests that you can do in the field to measure nitrate and prussic acid. I don't know how accurate they really are, but we can do laboratory tests and certainly be pretty accurate with understanding the nitrate concentration in forages. So if you need to know the nitrate concentration, you can take a sample and send it to a lab, and they can get that for you. Another aspect of these, nitrate is stable in the plant. So when you cut it for hay, for instance, the nitrate will remain in the hay, and so you can have hay that has high nitrate toxicity and still cause toxicity in animals. Prussic acid is not stable in the plant, and it's volatile, and so when you cut it for hay and the plant dries out, the prussic acid volatilizes out of the plant. So one way to deal with prussic acid poisoning in a forage would be to cut it for hay and use it that way, and that would eliminate the prussic acid problem, but it would not eliminate any nitrate problems that were in those plants. Let's see. This would show you kind of the recommendations for the content of these two toxins that are safe for cattle. And so you can see here in table 4 that the nitrate, the amount of nitrate is up to 3,000 parts per million is generally considered safe for all cattle. And then you can see how the toxicity levels go up when you get above 10,000 parts per million nitrate. That's potentially toxic for all cattle, and we wouldn't recommend that you feed that to any kind of cattle. But somewhere in between, there's different stages of cattle that can tolerate a little bit higher nitrate. So if you had some forage or some hay that was intermediate or moderate in nitrate content, say 5 to 7,000, you could feed that to potentially you could feed that to non-pregnant cows. You could feed it to older yearling stockers or those kind of animals, especially if they've had a little bit of time to adapt to the nitrate level, and probably be able to use that kind of forage successfully with those kind of cattle. You would not want to feed it to pregnant cows that were early in their gestation, could potentially cause abortions. So those are kind of management scenarios. Typically with nitrate hay, what we try to do to utilize it effectively is to dilute it with non-nitrate hay or some other diet ingredient, put it in a feedlot diet where you can dilute the overall nitrate concentration of the diet down to where it's safe. And then in table 2 is the interpretation for prussic acid poisoning. If you got a prussic acid test, and you can kind of see the parts per million of prussic acid that are dangerous there. There's not quite as much information on the levels of prussic acid. And remember, if you take a forage sample and you dry and you let it dry and send it to the lab, it's not going to have any prussic acid in the sample, but there still could be prussic acid in the forage, the fresh forage. So that's something to remember if you're doing tests for nitrate and prussic acid. So that's nitrate and prussic acid poisoning. Another disorder that you see commonly or somewhat commonly is grass tetany. And this is basically a magnesium and calcium deficiency that cattle get. It can be common with stockers. It can happen in cows. It can happen in lactating cows. A similar kind of thing is milk fever in lactating cows. It's not necessarily caused by the exact same thing, but it's kind of related. But grass tetany occurs when cattle graze lush, immature grasses, and so we worry about grass tetany a little bit in wheat pasture, and usually we'll provide supplements, mineral supplements to cattle grazing wheat pasture that contain some calcium and some magnesium, so that we can avoid grass tetany in those cattle. We'll potentially see grass tetany in the spring, like if you've had cattle that have been on dormant forage all winter and haven't had a good mineral supplement, and their magnesium and calcium status is low, and you turn those cattle in the spring into a new ryegrass pasture that's flush with ryegrass, and they don't have any magnesium or calcium supplements, you can see grass tetany in a situation like that. That would kind of be a classic way to set up grass tetany. And so, the way to prevent that is to make sure that the magnesium and calcium status of those cattle is in good shape before they're grazing those kind of lush, immature grasses. And then the last one that we'll talk about today is fescue toxicosis, and this happens. This is a disorder that happens with tall fescue, and you probably heard about tall fescue, but it's this disease or disorder in cattle is actually not caused by the grass itself. It's caused by a fungus, a fungal endophyte that infects the grass. And so you can see in this picture here, these are the grass cells of tall fescue. The rectangular things here are the cells of the grass, and this squiggly blue line is the endophyte that has infected this grass. It's stained blue in this slide, and that endophyte is a fungus, and it infects the grass, and actually provides several benefits to the grass in terms of being drought tolerant and resistant to grazing, and it kind of helps the grass. It's probably it wouldn't necessarily be a parasite to the grass. It would probably kind of be a symbiote to the grass. So it helps the grass to be more persistent. But many of these endophytes, the native natural endophytes, produce a chemical compound called ergovaline, and that compound, when cattle eat it, when animals eat it, it's a vasoconstrictor. It has several effects in the animals, but it constricts their blood vessels. And so basically what happens is you have reduced blood flow to the extremity of the animal, and more of the blood is shunted and held at the core of the animal's body, and it causes several kinds of problems. You can see animals lose their tails. You can see problems with feet in cattle. You can certainly see problems with heat stress because the animals can't dissipate the heat because the blood is staying in the core of their body. And so, several problems with fescue toxicosis, and this is a major issue in managing fescue. Fescue toxicosis is basically a problem in a big part of the southeastern United States. You can see here that fescue is adapted to about half of the United States, but it's really it's probably the main forage source in kind of the southeastern part of the United States, in the southern part of the Corn Belt. So from Missouri to Georgia and those areas those are predominantly fescue, and there's millions of cows in the United States that graze fescue every year, tall fescue, and almost all of the tall fescue that's in this area is infected with this endophyte that causes this problem. The variety of tall fescue that's predominant in all this area is Kentucky 31 tall fescue, and it has this endophyte. And there's varying degree. Different pastures have different infection levels, and certain cattle can tolerate the ergovaline concentrations better than other cattle. Cattle that have been selected for fescue tolerance can certainly tolerate it better. So there's all kinds of management strategies and approaches to dealing with this problem that people go through and have gone through for decades trying to deal with fescue toxicosis. One of the more recent ways to try to deal with it is there's actually been research done to develop endophytes that have the benefits. Well, let me first say there's been efforts to remove the endophyte from the fescue plant, and you can successfully do that. So you could eradicate fescue from a field and then plant seed of fescue that did not have the endophyte in it. The endophyte had been removed from the plant. That infection had been removed from the plant. and you can plant that, and the plants will grow. They're just not nearly as robust as the plants that have the endophyte in them. They're not as drought tolerant. They're not as vigorous. They're not as tolerant to grazing. And so when you take the endophyte out of fescue, it's basically not fescue anymore. It turns into something else that, I mean, it's still genetically, it's still fescue, but it doesn't have the same agronomic traits that it used to have. So that's a problem. And so one of the more recent research approaches has been to develop endophytes that um, that can be infected into the grass plants that provide many of the benefits to the grass, but they don't produce ergovaline, or they produce much less ergovaline than the native endophytes, and those are called novel endophytes. A lot of times you'll see those different varieties marketed as such and such variety, and it'll say E minus or something, and that may mean or E E naught or something, and that'll mean that potentially indicating that there's a novel endophyte in there. Sometimes E minus means without the endophyte, and then in some advertising things you'll see that E minus means the novel endophyte in the advertising literature. And so one of those varieties that's come out is called Max Q fescue, and it's a variety of fescue that's got a novel endophyte in it, and it actually appears to be pretty effective at being a good forage and not causing this fescue toxicosis disorder in animals. Whether that is cost effective, there's lots of research going on to see the ways that that can be cost effective. But that's kind of what fescue is about. This gives you an idea of what you may see on calves that come from places that have been grazing fescue. And this animal that's marked susceptible, you can see how he's got that really rough hair coat, and that's pretty indicative of what would be called fescue cattle in the industry. This animal, because of that ergovaline and the reduced blood flow, didn't shed his hair very good. He wasn't. He was probably heat stressed through most of the summer, and probably for the next 30 to 60 days is susceptible to heat stress even in a new environment. And so we get cattle like this into Oklahoma as stockers a lot that have come from fescue country, and we have to take measures for the next 30 to 60 days to prevent heat stress on these animals so that they can perform, and eventually they get that ergovaline out of their system, and their blood flow goes back to normal, and they can kind of tolerate heat and the environment like the other cattle. But that's an example of what a susceptible animal looks like and what a tolerant animal looks like. And you can Google fescue toxicosis and read a lot more about different fescues and their effects and treatments and those kind of things right now. So far, there's really no treatment that you can give an animal to prevent fescue toxicosis. It's just one of those things. If you're grazing fescue, you have to have a management plan for it, because you really can't treat the animal and prevent it. And then there are other minor things that we could talk about. Bermuda grass staggers is a nutritional disorder that happens occasionally in Bermuda grass, and there's numerous toxic plants that we could talk about later in the class. But that's an overview of the more common nutritional disorders you'll see in grazing systems, certainly in Oklahoma.